Hero, with Passover just around the corner, you may have a lot of questions about how we celebrate this holiday. You may even have questions about questions. In the Passover Seder, in the Magid section, the storytelling part of the Seder, my very favorite part, there is... Whoa! In the Magid section, in my very favorite part of the entire Seder, because we're telling our people's master story, our origin story, there is a section called the Four Questions. Today, we will learn what those four questions are and what's the one answer to all four of those questions right after this bass. Boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom, ba boom. That's not really what it's going to sound like. Welcome, everybody, to another live studio recording of the Jew Curious Show podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the four questions that are asked at the Passover Seder. There actually can be way more questions at that, but there's one section that's called the Four Questions. And so today, yesterday I reflected on the 4 cups of wine and what that's all about. Tomorrow I'll be talking about the 4 kinds of children. But today I wanted to focus on another 4. I feel like Count Von Count should be in here. 4 cups. In any case, today we're going to be talking about the 4 questions for Passover. If you are just joining one of my videos for the first time, if you're looking for 2 minutes or 90 seconds summary of the 4 questions, this is not that. We're going to have a bit of a longer discussion today about the Passover Seder, specifically focusing on the 4 questions. What are they? Why do we care, and what's the answer that answers all 4 of those questions? So really happy to do this again in a live studio setting, God willing, before Passover. This will be posted up as a Jew Curious Show episode. I've got a few different Passover specials coming out. So really excited to have everybody here. I'll give shout outs to everybody in just a minute. Going to take a silence print, which is something we do when recording a podcast session. All right. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey Weissenberg and Hadar Ensemble, for those inspiring, not remotely questionable opening beats. Thank you to the live studio audience who is here joining us for this. And thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. If you haven't already, I highly recommend, as your rabbi, that you subscribe to this podcast. If you do, if you tap that little subscribe button on your phone or your podcast listening device, you will automatically download all future episodes of this podcast, as well as have easy access to our archive of coming up on nearly 40 episodes at this point, all automatically delivered to you. You don't have to work too hard. You can just listen. As I said before, this episode is being recorded in front of a live studio audience via YouTube Live. People on the chat saying hello right now. Let's give some shout outs to our audience. Hello, Karen from Philadelphia. Good to see you. Welcome, Trig. Glad to have you back. And Kathy from Southern California. Susan is here from Florida. Miriam is here from delightful New Hampshire. Live free or die is their license plate motto. I think that's a great sentiment for Passover as well. Erica Harsanya, welcome back from Florida. Nice to see you. William Morales, good to see you, brother. And Val says, howdy, y'all. Speaking my language. All righty, let's get into it. Always nice to have a great live studio audience here who are asking their questions about Passover as we speak. In just a second, we are going to get into the 4 questions. Just want to give credit where credit is due. This podcast is made possible by the students of the Jew Curious School. This is an online-only school for learning Jewish stuff. Every week we get together 3 times live, first to study the Parashat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion, which, if you're wondering, this week is Pesach. We don't have the normal Torah portion this week because the first day of Passover falls on Shabbat, and we're doing a special reading for that. We'll be talking about that later today, in fact, in the Jew Curious School. We also have a weekly class from a new series that we start every month going in depth on some Jewish topic, as well as our ongoing complete Introduction to Judaism course. But my favorite part of the Jew Curious School is the community forum where people get together, they introduce themselves, they share their journeys, they share their questions and their struggles, and they share support with one another. And I'm very proud of the community that has been built in the Jew Curious School. If you are interested in that, go to jewcurious.school/info and see if it is right for you. But right now, I want to take a deep dive into the 4 questions. Before I do, I just want to, let me say that again. Before I jump into the 4 questions, what are they? And hope maybe you're having a question about that. Let's see. But I'm going to go into some other questions to see what's going on in our chat. Karen from Philadelphia shares, "Hi all, my Friday night hostess isn't having a Seder after all. That is unfortunate." She says, "Now I'm at loose ends. It's a bit late to ask around, but that's what I'm doing. And I will just say a word of blessing and support that it's absolutely okay to ask around. I completely understand, but don't be shy." I've said this over and over again here, that people, if you're looking for a Seder to go to, don't feel shy about asking Jewish people that you know whether they have an extra seat at their Seder. It's not like crashing a wedding or inviting yourself to somebody's birthday party. It's totally okay to see if there are places at a Seder table. It is a mitzvah for someone to host you, and if you ask the question and they're able to host you, you are helping them do that mitzvah. So don't be shy, and Karen, blessings of good luck and success in finding a place to eat on Friday night. Susan asks, "Going to my first Seder Friday night, do we eat anything during the event besides the actual dinner we ordered?" Just wondering. Yes, in fact, this Seder is replete with appetizers. Sometimes people will have a little bit of a nosh ahead of time. And I'm not saying like you have to pregame the Seder at home. There is, depending on where you go, a lengthy ritual or a lengthy ceremony that happens before you get into the main dinner itself. But during that order of ritual, there are various times where we eat things, not terribly filling things, like dipping some parsley in salt water. Maybe there's an egg involved, a little bit of matzah, some horseradish, things like that. But many places you go will have, a little bit of food laid out beforehand because there's a little bit of time between starting the Seder and eating. And so we like to make sure nobody's getting too hangry, as it were, because hanger can ruin a Passover Seder for you and for the people around you. So I wouldn't worry too much. There will be food before the dinner starts, but just in case you are worried, maybe have a little bit of a snack before you go. Not a terrible idea. Carmen has joined us from Henderson, Nevada. Says, "A good day to all." A good day to you, Carmen. Thank you for joining us. Kathy asks, "Are Haggadah readings the same for every day of Passover?" Pretty much. When something unique happens, like it falls on Shabbat, we have additional blessings thrown in there for Shabbat, and that's only one day. So this Friday night's Haggadah will have slight variations because the first night of Passover is happening on Shabbat. So when you light candles, you'll light the candles not just for the Yom Tov, the holiday, but for Shabbat and for the Yom Tov. When you say Birkat Hamazon at the end, when you say the grace after the meals, it will not just be for a Pesach meal, but for a Shabbat meal as well. So that's why it's kind of unique. But anytime, even when it doesn't fall on Shabbat, the second night will have what we call counting of the Omer. So you might be counting, saying a formula for the fact that right after Passover, we start counting the Omer. That means that means we count the 50 days between That means we count the 7 weeks day by day from Passover to Shavuot, and that begins the second night of Pesach. So there's a little bit of extra in there as well. But for the most part, the Haggadah is exactly the same. Just it will have notations where things get different, so you don't have to memorize anything. Just follow along with the Haggadah. Kathy asks, is there a minimum number of people you need for a Seder? We have 2 right now. That's an excellent start. I will say you can have a Seder all by your lonesome. Let's say you are circumnavigating the globe solo by boat, and it happens to be Passover, and you packed your matzah because you knew that was going to be the case. You can have a Seder by yourself. I wouldn't recommend it. If at all possible, be with other people, and the larger number is better. Don't knock yourself out. You can have a Seder with 2 people. If you can get a third, that's even better. But it's totally okay. The more the merrier, I'll say. But don't sweat it, and don't feel like you're not allowed to do a Seder with just 2 people. But I would encourage you to get creative because, like I said, the more the merrier. So get creative with how you expand your head count. When my wife and I first got married, we wanted to host our first Seder as a married couple, and all of our Jewish friends had plans. They had already made arrangements with their families and couldn't join us. So we invited as many of our non-Jewish friends as we could to come. And I think it was like on a Wednesday or Thursday night too. So they weren't expecting to have a dinner party that night, but we had them over and it was a blast. Erica says, I saw Coke for Passover at the grocery store. Is that like Mexican Coke because there's no corn syrup, or there is a difference? I will say there's a bit of a difference because the formulation, as I understand, and I don't work for the Coca-Cola people, so I don't get any kickbacks from them. And if I get anything wrong, Coke, don't sue me. I'm not going to reveal any secrets. All I know is that what Passover Coke and Coke from Mexico has in common is that they both use sugar instead of corn syrup. However, I don't know that the formulation is exactly the same because one year, right after Passover, we had some leftover Passover Coca-Cola, and my sons and I went out to the grocery store. We picked up a couple of bottles of Coke from Mexico, and we did a taste test to see if they were the same, and they are not. I will say, at least in the results of that blind taste test, Mexican Coke had a slight edge over American Coca-Cola that was kosher for Passover. So they're not exactly the same, but they do have in common that they don't have they have sugar instead of corn syrup because corn syrup comes from corn, which is considered kitniot, which is something that many people do not eat during Passover. Jason says, dinner ideas for 7 days over Passover, please. And Erica shares, Jason, have you thought of making matzah pizza? Kathy shares, Jason, cookbooks with Passover chapters and YouTube demos for recipes. Yeah, I would just hit YouTube. Big fan of YouTube, by the way. Type in kosher dinner, or type in Passover dinner or Passover dinner recipes, things like that. And you will find all sorts of resources. A popular one other than matzah pizza is matzah lasagna. You make sort of a lasagna, but instead of using the lasagna noodles, you use rectangles of matzah. I've seen a similar kind of enchilada bake arrangement, any sorts of casseroles, but there's all sorts of things you could do, especially if you're on like a paleo diet or if you're vegan, you don't have to worry about it too much because if you're vegan, you don't have to worry about it too much as long as you're excluding the bread. If you have a gluten-free diet, that largely avoids Passover stuff as well. But just look for recipes without bread, and there's lots of ways you can eat healthfully that way. Vanessa asks, how long is a Reform Seder? Is it shorter than Conservative and Orthodox? Does it make a difference? So I can't tell you how long a Reform Seder is. First off, I've never been to one or been to one that was explicitly Reform. I've been to lots of Seders that were mixes of conservative people and Reform people and even Orthodox people in the same space having a Seder together. It doesn't really, there's no stopwatch that is presented by the denomination that says it has to be this long or this short. So a Passover Seder is a Passover Seder. My first several years of doing a Seder was in a household that the synagogue that the people belonged to was Reform, but the Seder was a very traditional Seder because their grandparents were very traditional people. It really varies household to household or place to place. So I can't tell you that it'll be necessarily shorter because it's in one denomination or another. See if there are any other questions before we get started. All right. Let's get into it. I tipped off people in the... Let's get into it. I tipped off people in the recording yesterday that I may, in fact, sing today, and I might as well. Let me just clear the pipes out a little bit. All right. Red leather, yellow leather, unique New York, unique New York. She sells seashells by the seashore. So let's get into this. Today we are talking about the 4 questions in the Passover Seder, and the essence of the 4 questions is asking, and the essence of the 4 questions is kind of the master question: why is this night different from all other nights? Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylot. Like, why is this night different from all other nights? And that's sort of the Ur question that has 4 variations. The first is, why on this night do we eat chametz instead of either chametz? The first variation is, why on this night do we eat matzah exclusively, whereas other nights we might eat matzah or chametz, leavened bread. The second question is, why on all other nights do we eat any kind of vegetable, but tonight we only eat bitter vegetables or bitter herbs? The third question is, on all other nights, we don't typically dip our food, right? And this is, if you're into nachos and things like that, that might be different. But there's a ritual in the Passover Seder where you take some green vegetables and you dip it in salt water that represents the tears that accompany slavery. So when we take the karpas and we take the green vegetable, before we eat it, we dip it in salt water. And our question is, why do we know on all other, so our question is, on all other nights we don't normally do this. Why are we doing this tonight? And the fourth question points out that on all other nights we eat either sitting up straight or reclining while we eat. Why on this night do we recline while we eat? And you may be sitting at a table during your Passover Seder in a regular type chair, not reclining while you eat, but even if that's the case, you may recline or lean to one side while you take a drink of wine. This represents the history of the Passover Seder as a leisurely meal in which people recline. And so the fourth question is, why do we have an intention to be especially leisurely on this night where we don't on all other nights? And I promised you guys a song, so I'm going to give it my best. Just for posterity, just in case people are learning a song, you will have this to come back to as a recording. And it goes a little something like this. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylot, shebechol halaylot anu ochlin hametzu matzah, halayla hazeh kulo matzah, halayla hazeh kulo matzah. That's the question where we eat matzah on this night, but not on other nights. Second question. Shebechol halaylot anu ochlin, she'ar yerachot, halayla hazeh, maror, halayla hazeh, maror. That's pointing out that on this night we eat bitter herbs, on all other nights we eat all kinds of vegetables. What's up with that? Here comes the third question. Shebachol halelot ein anu matbilin afilu pa'am echat, afilu pa'am echat. Halayla hazeh shetei fe'amim. Halayla hazeh shetei fe'amim. Right, this goes to the question, most nights we don't dip our food in stuff, but tonight we dip 2 times. That's shetei fe'amim. Here comes the fourth question about reclining or sitting up straight while you eat. Shebachol halelot anu ochlin ben yoshvinu vein mesuvin, ben yoshvinu vein mesubin. Halayla hazeh kulanu mesubin. Halayla hazeh kulanu mesubin. So those are the 4 questions sung in Hebrew. It's a little bit Hebrew Aramaic because there's a final nun on those things where otherwise there might be a mem sofit. That's just a little bit of Hebrew diction and Hebrew and Aramaic diction and spelling differences. But this comes from the time of the Talmud, where the border between Hebrew and Aramaic was somewhat fluid in rabbinic writings. And so those are the 4 questions that are sung on a Passover Seder. If you don't feel like singing them, you can just repeat them out loud. You can say them in English. That's okay too. It's okay to do this ritual in whatever language you understand. However, we like to encourage people to learn the Hebrew, to learn the text as a way of carrying on that tradition from one generation to another. And so we ask these 4 questions. Why is this night different from all other night? For example, matzah, maror, dipping the food, and mesubin, or reclining while you eat. And the answer to all 4 of those questions is the same. And that is because once we were slaves in Egypt, and God rescued us from that condition, and now we are a free people. And to commemorate that occasion, to reinforce that relationship with Hashem, every year we get together and we do things a little bit differently, right? We have bitter herbs to remind us of the bitterness of slavery. We dip our food in salt water to remind us of the tears of slavery. We eat matzah, what we call the lachma anya, the bread of affliction, to remember that we were rescued from slavery, but we had to leave so fast that we couldn't even allow our bread to rise. And so every year we spend a week eating unrisen bread, if you will. And finally, why do we have this encouragement or tendency to recline while we're eating? Is because we can. Is because we are a free people and we should eat at leisure like a free people. There's a custom, it's a little bit in halakha and a little bit in minchag, where Jews are discouraged from standing while they eat or eating while we walk. Like sometimes you're in a hurry, you grab a sandwich and you're scooting down the street and you're eating while you're walking, or you're eating while you're standing up. I remember many years ago I was eating a sandwich over the sink and my father caught me doing that, and he said, "Don't do that, son. Divorced people do that." And my father had been divorced at some point in his life. Has been with my mom for, I'm going to say 44, going on 45 years. But before that, he was a divorced person. I too have been a divorced person, so I kind of get it. But we're generally encouraged to eat sitting down on all occasions. Like stop, sit down, focus on what you're doing. We got this bounty from God. Let's enjoy it as a free people. And all the more so on Passover, when we eat, we're encouraged to at least relax, if not fully recline. And this symbolizes our freedom. We don't have any place else to be. We don't have to go be making bricks for Pharaoh. So let's chill out. All of these things are designed to not only help us remember being freed from slavery, but to embody that, right? We are taught that each of us in every generation should think as if we ourselves were liberated from Egypt, even though that's been a very, very long time. And some of us, like me, joined this family later. We weren't born to this, so we can't say my genetic ancestors were freed from Egypt. However, because I'm a part of this family, because I'm a part of this covenant, it's still incumbent upon me to think every year, imagine that I myself got to go free that night when it happened. And so to do this, we act it out. We eat things, like we're taking bits of the story into our body. There was a historian or Jewish writer who said, on Passover, Jews eat their history. And this is imagining. This is a little bit like, so this is a little bit like Thanksgiving dinner, where we eat things that remind us, some people eat corn or cornbread or turkey, reminding us of the discovery of turkey, I guess, in the New World. I'm not a Thanksgiving historian, but for, every family, every holiday meal, we have traditional foods that connect us to the history where that holiday came from. And this is so we literally take into our bodies elements of our master story. Sometimes when I teach Passover in an introduction to Judaism setting, I ask people, okay, why does Superman have superpowers? And they say, well, everybody knows Superman was launched from Krypton as a baby, and when he got to Earth, the Earth's yellow sun gave him these powers, and so he used it to fight for justice. I was like, okay, well, you seem to know that origin story for Superman, why he is the way he is. How about Spider-Man? And people say, well, of course, Spider-Man got bitten by a radioactive spider, and then he used those powers to get into pro wrestling to help make some money. But then his uncle died, and he decided to fight crime instead, because with great power comes great responsibility. And people could just rattle off these origin stories of their favorite superheroes and why that origin story made them the way they are. And I say, well, what's our origin story? And people kind of scratch their heads a little bit, and I say, well, we were slaves. We had a covenant with God. God remembered that covenant, rescued us from slavery, and forevermore we would be a free people who would not be permanently subjugated to any other force on earth. And every other force on earth that has attempted to permanently subjugate us has now faded into the sands of history. And we are still here every year celebrating Passover and remembering we were freed by God. And that gives us strength to endure. It also, as Uncle Ben said to Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. We are now the memory and conscience of humanity, that we are encouraged to fight against slavery and subjugation every place else on the earth that we see it. And the purpose of the 4 questions is to make that real and present for us in the moment of the Passover Seder. And it raises sort of a larger meta-narrative of the Passover Seder itself, is why do we do these weird things? So that you'll ask questions about them. Because when you begin to ask those questions, when your mind is, say, a fertile field of curiosity, that's when the lessons and the understanding can creep in. And so we don't eat bitter herb for its own sake. We eat bitter herb to get somebody to say, hey, what's with the bitter herb? Aha, that's because we were slaves and it was bitter. And then we do weird things like taking parsley or a green vegetable and dipping it in salt water, which for its own sake isn't much of an appetizer, really. It's not terribly filling. That's usually the stuff you leave on the edge of the plate, especially at Denny's. I remember growing up going to Denny's, and my mom said, don't eat that. That's just a garnish. And they probably put that on there from, the plate before you had that plate. But we take this parsley and we dip it in salt water so that people will say, why are you doing this weird stuff? Oh, because I was a slave once, and it made me cry. And I'd never want to do that again, and I never want anybody else to go through that again. So every year I take parsley and I dip it in salt water. Right? We do strange things so that people will ask about those strange things, and our answer can be, I was a slave. God set me free. I am now a free person. I don't answer to anybody but God. And I want to, throughout my life, help other people realize that redemption and freedom as well. So that's the 4 questions, the main 4 questions of Passover. But any questions beyond that are okay too, right? Why do we have 3 matzahs on the table? Well, one answer is that they represent the Avot, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why do we drink 4 cups of wine? We discussed this in a prior episode where there are lots of reasons given. One is that God used 4 different verbs talking about freeing us from slavery. The other is the imahot, right? We have the avot and the 3 matzot. The imahot, or our matriarchs, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, or Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, 4 ladies who made us who we are, 4 cups of wine. So that gives us an excuse to tell another part of our story about our matriarchs, just as the matzah gives us an excuse to talk about our patriarchs. All of these things are set up in a way to remind us of elements of our history, of our narrative, of our master story, of our origin story, who made us who we are and gave us our mission in the world. Hey, why is there that extra cup of wine on the table that nobody's drinking out of? Well, because on Passover, this is a season of our liberation, of our redemption. And so we have a tradition that when Mashiach comes, or when this era of peace begins, Eliyahu, or Elijah the prophet, will show up first, and we're setting a cup of wine out for him on every Passover table on earth, because he could come to any table at any Passover and say, now's the time. Now's the time that the world's going to be different from now on. And so we have these little embodiments of our history, symbols of our story, so that people will ask questions about them. And all the more so, you should open up your Passover Seder to people who have never experienced it before, because they are going to be the most curious. However, people who have been doing it for decades can continue to be curious. There's a passage in the Maggid where a rabbi says, I have been, where there's a passage in the Maggid in the storytelling where a rabbi says, I'm a man of 70 years old, and I never quite understood why we did this thing until now, which goes to show you that every year you could be curious about a new thing. And so not just because this is the Jew Curious show and we cater to curious people, especially people who are curious about Judaism, I'm going to say this holiday was tailor-made for you. This is the holiday of curiosity, because it is only through curiosity and persisting in that curiosity and being open to answers that you can learn. That's what I wanted to share with you about the 4 questions today. You have a little recording of me singing it in my froggy voice this morning. Took my allergy pill a little late, I think, so I'm a little bit Tom Waitsy today. I like this music of Tom Waits, so sometimes I sing that way. If you want to hear it more in your key, just go to YouTube, search for the 4 questions or 4 questions Passover. You can find a lot sweeter recordings than that, but I wanted to put this out there for people. So before we conclude this episode, I just want to jump into the chat to see if. So before we conclude this episode, I want to jump back into the chat to see what other questions people have. Fernando is joining us. Good afternoon from New York City. Kathy shares, free people slouch. Yes, you can slouch when you're a free person. I prefer to think of it as reclining, right? We're not going to make any comments on people's posture, but chill out. Don't worry about sitting up straight on Passover. Kathy says, bravo and thanks for singing. Good job. I appreciate that, Kathy. I really do. But to that point, Miriam from New Hampshire asks, do you have to chant it if you don't know the melody or sing off key? No, you do not. You do not have to sing it for it to be a kosher Seder. You can absolutely read it if you are more comfortable doing that. But I like to encourage people to sing off key. There's something about lifting up your voice as best you can that has its own kind of music to it. One of my teachers, Joey Weissenberg, whose musical group did the intro music for this podcast. Well, I didn't do it for this podcast, but I asked if I could borrow it. Tells a story about a flute that had been around since the days of Moses. And this was a flute that was kept in the temple. And Solomon, who was beautifying things in the temple, said, "Hey, let's take this flute. It's kind of a beat up looking wooden flute. It's cracked at one end. Let's fix it up. Let's cover it with gold. Let's make it special as is its due." And so we got the finest craftsmen of the land to take this little wooden flute, paste up the broken parts and cover it with gold. And then Solomon himself played it, and it sounded terrible. It had kind of a sweet note before. It sounded a little busted, sounded a little bit rustic, but when they covered it with gold, it barely made any sound at all, and he couldn't get the notes out right. And so Solomon instructed all of the artisans of the kingdom to make the flute back the way it was. Similarly, there was a story about a cymbal that was cracked, or a bell, and Solomon thought it should be repaired, had the finest artisans of the land, the finest braziers or bronziers or whatever you call those folks, fix it back together again, but the sound just wasn't as sweet, so he had them change it back. And Joey Weissenberg teaches this to say that whatever voice you are bringing to the table, if it is your voice and you are singing it with an open heart, dedicated to the holiness of the occasion, that is the sweetest sound anybody can make. So I wouldn't worry too much about singing off key. If you're super self-conscious about what I like to tell people when I'm teaching a song, I say, if you're worried about the sound of your voice in this group, close your eyes while you sing. Because if your eyes are closed, nobody can see that it's you singing. And so I encourage people to do that. I don't know if you know how that works out, or that I borrowed that idea from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So but Miriam says, "Bo, you haven't heard me sing." So that's quite all right. I'm sure however you sing the 4 questions, if you sing them, will be beautiful. And Jason shares, "Singing at Shabbat, I'm still shy about it though, lol." That's okay. I feel like when a bunch of I feel like, especially in a Shabbat setting, when a bunch of imperfect voices, and ultimately we all are imperfect voices, when all of those voices come together, there is a transcendent music that comes out of that, all its own, and it always winds up sounding great. It just always works out that way. Sorry, just looking through the chat for some questions. Miriam from New Hampshire also asked, "Great question for Passover. Does everyone have to participate if they're going around the table, unless it's something easy like taking turns reading?" Participate however you feel comfortable. It's totally okay to say pass, or we'll let the next person do it. That's fine too, but I would encourage you to add your voice, to be brave, to be curious, to try it out. However, it's totally okay if you want to pass it to the next person. I've heard of people telling me of their traditional Passover Seders back in the day, where the one grandfather would sit at the end of the table and he would read the entire Haggadah himself, and everybody just had to sit there while he did that. They didn't get to pass it around. Sometimes people pass it around to popcorn style, like reading in classrooms and things like that, where some people, when they could, would read it in Hebrew or the Aramaic. Some people would read it in English. They would take turns. That's quite all right. However you can participate is just fine. If you choose to pass it, that's just fine too. Miriam's asking if I can sing Kol Nidre. I'm good for about the first 2 words, but the Kol Nidre. No, I'm going to stop that right now. So maybe I'll practice Kol Nidre for the High Holy Days when we start talking about Yom Kippur. But thank you for asking. So Miriam further elaborates, if everyone is going around the table in Hebrew, it's okay to break the flow by doing your part in English. Absolutely. I think that's perfectly okay. Or at least it has been at every Passover Seder I've ever attended in multiple different households with multiple different levels of facility with the language. Kathy shares, there's a rabbi in our area who doesn't always sing on key, but with the help of the cantor, piano player, flute player, and congregation, it all sounds great. There was a teaching I heard from another musician many years ago saying, when you're teaching other people to sing, sometimes it helps if you don't have a perfect voice. If you have a perfect voice and you're trying to lead people in song, some people will just sit back and say, well, I can't sing like that. I'm just going to listen to him, or I'm just going to listen to her. And if you have a perfect voice, it actually can be discouraging for people. So this person who was a skilled musician would intentionally sound a little rough when he sang so that it would encourage other people to feel like, well, I can sing as good as that guy or almost as good as that guy, so I'll sing along too, or I'll help out by singing even better. And so sometimes it's that imperfect voice that encourages other people to sing. All right, everybody, All right, before we wrap up, I just want to express my deep gratitude to the live studio audience today for bringing great questions, for enduring my singing, and I want to thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious show. If you would like to participate in an upcoming live studio recording, the best thing to do is go to YouTube, look for Rabbi John Carrier, that's John with an H, Rabbi with two B's, Carrier with three R's, and you can find all the upcoming live sessions we have scheduled out, and pick a time, click the little notification button so you'll be notified when we are live. Join us, ask your questions, and if you do, you are doing a solid for the entire Jew Curious community, because if you have a question, Hero, chances are somebody else has that question too, and by your asking it and getting an answer, everybody who has that question gets an answer. And that's how we build this podcast together. Another great thing to do to get connected to people of this community is to join the Jew Curious Community Center. All you have to do is go to jewcurious.show/JCC, as in Jew Curious Community Center, and you will fill out a little form and you will receive thorough and complete instructions on how to find our private, lovingly tended, carefully guarded, troll-free Facebook community of Jew curious people just like you. There I find people sharing their questions, answering each other's questions, and I'll jump in from time to time to answer questions if I need to. But for the most part, this is a very supportive, welcoming, warm community of people who have questions just like you do. And we set this up in a way that people can feel comfortable asking what questions they have, answering what questions, seek support, give support, and I've been really proud of the community that we have put together there. Finally, one last time I want to mention that the Jew Curious show is brought to you by the students of the Jew Curious community. Finally, I just want to reiterate that this podcast is made possible by the Jew Curious School. This is an online school where Jew curious people just like you get together. We learn Torah live weekly. We learn about some topic of the month where we take a deep dive into a particular Jewish topic. We've talked about holidays. We've talked about holidays. We've talked about kashrut. We've talked about Jewish time, Jewish space, Jewish thought. And there is a complete and ongoing Introduction to Judaism course that you can join at any time. But the best part is the community that has come together around this learning, how people welcome one another, how people support one another. That is what I am most proud of in this community. If you want to check it out and see if it's right for you, go to jewcurious.school, school/info, and find out everything you need to know. Once again, Hero, I really appreciate your joining us today. Just as I appreciate the live studio audience who have brought their hearts, just as I appreciate the live studio audience who have brought their hearts and their questions to this, just as I appreciate the live studio audience who have brought their questions and their hearts to today's discussion. And until next time, Hero, peace. All right, that concludes the podcast recording. I'll hang around for a little bit longer if people have more questions. Let's see. Miriam was asking, were they allowed to come into contact with the barley on the second day of Passover to bring it to the temple? So supposedly, this is marking the barley harvest. We're counting out the sheaves for the Omer. And, for the most part, we're not supposed to eat or come in contact with or own grain. However, there is an ongoing barley harvest, and these sheaves were being counted out as of Passover, and so there must be some way that they were able to do this. That's a question I've never been asked before, never asked myself, so I'm going to take a look into that. So I'm going to be very upfront, I don't have all the answers, folks. This is an ongoing process for me. I learn by teaching, and so I'm going to go back and do a little homework on how you accomplish Omer when you're not supposed to have barley around. So we'll figure that out together. Let's see what other questions people have. Maybe I'll splice it back into the show if I can. Thank you, Kathy, for encouraging everyone. If you have enjoyed watching this, if you've liked this session, please hit the thumbs up button down below the video. There's a little picture of a thumb up. If you have a thumb down, give it a thumb down. Be honest, folks. But if you enjoyed it, please click the like button at the bottom of this video. All right, with that, I think we're going to wrap up today. And yes, as Kathy says, I encourage anybody who's in the Jew Curious School, keep asking these questions there, so we'll have them archived in our community forum as well. Just a little bit of housekeeping for people who are in the school, and I see a lot of you out there right now. Today we're talking at 3 p.m. Pacific about the Torah portion of the week, which this week happens to be not one of your normal Torah portions, but the Torah reading for the first day of Pesach when it falls on Shabbat. And so there's already a link in the community forum to what all of those readings are. And by 3 p.m. Pacific, there will be a post up that you can join the live conversation via Zoom. After that, at 4:30 today, we're starting a new mini course series on Jewish time, where we've talked a lot about this before, but I want to do a very focused deep dive into the subject of Jewish time, how we measure time, how time is parceled out, get a little bit more into the lunisolar calendar, how that works, how we have sort of different seasons of the year, not in just the leaves falling and snow falling, but like spiritual seasons of the year, how halachic time works, like how we measure sunup, sundown, midday, midnight, are a little bit different in Jewish law than they are in how we do things out in the secular world. So we'll be doing a full series on that starting today. And then tomorrow in the Introduction to Judaism course, we will get into the Jewish fall holidays, specifically the high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but also talk a little bit about Sukkot as that comes within that season. So join us for that if you're in the Jew Curious School. If you're not and you want to check it out, just go to the link you see on the video here or go to jewcurious.school/info. See if it's for you. You're welcome to try it out. And if you try it out for a month and you don't care for it, then we have a full guarantee that make everybody whole, no judgments, no hassles. Only want you to be there if you decide that it's right for you. And with that, I'm just going to sign off for today. Really appreciate everybody bringing your questions, bringing your hearts to this discussion, supporting one another in this learning. And until next time, heroes, peace.